Good morning. It's a pleasure to be with you this morning and continuing our journey into the book of Isaiah. So we're still going to be in chapters 1 through 37 this Sunday and also next Sunday. We'll move out of that a little bit next Sunday in recognition of Easter. But as we've been discussing, chapters 1 through 37 can be given a heading of the Book of the King. And it talks of three types of kings. It talks of a messianic king that is to come sometime in the future. It discusses the kings of David that are currently, in this point in history, reigning over Judah. And it talks about God as king. And that's where our focus is going to be today, is on the God of the universe, the completeness and the expanse of the reign of God. And we will see this in three cycles of oracles that we'll point out today. And again, we're not going to do a verse-by-verse reading that would consume all of the time and more that we have available to us. I just want to remind you, though, when our first session together, I took us back to the book of Deuteronomy chapter 30, and specifically verses 15 and 19. And I'll probably continue to remind you of this because it is a very important element in the study of Isaiah. Sometimes it's easy to get lost, especially in these chapters that we're going to be looking at, chapters 13 through 27, because of all the prophecies against the lands that surround Judah, the prophecies against Israel, the northern nation, and against Judah and Jerusalem itself. And the reason it's easy to get lost is because as you start to read these, sometimes it can be rather depressing, because God is not holding any punches. He's not hiding what he is about to do. He's being very direct with his people and all the nations that surround his people. And he tells them the destruction that's coming, and he gives them the reason for that destruction, and that's what we're going to explore today. But in that, the premises that we get, especially out of the book of Deuteronomy, that are emphasized again in Isaiah, is that we arrive in these positions by choice. It's by the choices that people make that determine whether they are truly people of God or they are outside of God's family. And we've discussed in Deuteronomy chapter 30, verses 15 and 19, how they point out the choices we have are death and destruction, and life and prosperity, curses and blessings. And that it becomes very evident, if you've been reading through the book of Isaiah, that should be very evident to you, that these predictions are coming about not because God is a mean God and he just likes to punish people and he gets enjoyment out of inflicting bad things upon people. It's because God is a God of righteousness and a God of judgment. And if you choose to live outside of him, then your expectation should be nothing but one of judgment. If you live with God, as also we pointed out in the book of Deuteronomy, it's very clear there, and it is a continuing theme throughout the Bible from Genesis through Revelation. If we choose to be with God, God will make it so easy for us. He will jump in and walk with you the entire way. He will support you and hold you up, and he will be with you. So it's not the idea that we have to go through this journey on our own. God is willing to stand right beside us and do that. And He is a faithful God, and that's been demonstrated throughout the generations of mankind. To the point where God sent His own Son to live on this earth as a human, as fully human, and to sacrifice Himself so that we can come back into a true and right relationship with the God that we serve. The universal kingdom, where God is king. So in chapters 13 through 27, if you've read these, or if you haven't yet, I encourage you to go ahead and read them. This will become very evident to you. And it talks about all the nations in and around Jerusalem and Israel and Judah, and God's interaction with them. But also another thing to look for that we will point out here today, God is just as much the God of those people as He is to the Jews. It was never God's intent for Him to be exclusive to a particular people group. He blessed the Jews because of His promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But His intent was never to do that at the expense of the rest of us. His intent was for God's people, the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to be a shining light, to be an example to the rest of the world, that the God that they served was the true Creator God, the only God, the only thing in our experience, in our existence, that deserves our worship. The universal kingdom. In these three cycles of prophecy that occur between chapters 13 and 27, there are some elements that you will see start to develop. If you are a note taker, as you read through, you'll see certain passages that speak to this. First and foremost is that the Lord cares for His people. He truly does. Now, I've encouraged you to look at the writings of Hosea and also of Micah, who were contemporaries with Isaiah. Hosea chapter 11 is a very emotional chapter. It's very raw. God goes from a range of emotions of just absolute fury with His people to where He is just going to wipe them out, to where He catches Himself and states that, no, I can't do that, because I am God and I am not man. So even when we are at our worst, God is always at His best. The perfect, loving, compassionate parent who wants nothing more than success and prosperity and blessings for His children. The Lord cares for His people. Another element that may be a little more subtle to you as you read through it, but it is there. Passage of time is never an indicator of God's faithfulness towards us. And we can see that throughout the Bible story. God's promises to Abraham took time. God's promises to His people took time. Whether it was the time of the Exodus, whether it was the time of the exile in Babylon and Persia, time is never an indicator of how God loves us and blesses us. We measure everything in time. Time is an extremely important dimension to us. To God, it is nothing. Time is not a constraint that God exists by. And we'll see this because throughout these prophecies, and especially within these chapters, Isaiah starts to talk about Babylon. Babylon doesn't even exist for another 100 years. So Isaiah is talking about things that the people that he is writing to will never experience and never find in regard to Babylon and what Babylon is going to do. Time is nothing to God. And so many, we get into situations where we cry out to God and we get impatient and we demand God to do something. And we have heard many lessons over the last several years that the blessings that we seek and that we identify that we should receive are probably not the blessings that God has in store for us. There are blessings. And any goodness that you encounter, any blessings that you have in life, you can thank God for those. It's the only reason they exist. But God chooses His own time and His own way to look with favor upon His people. We get impatient. We are very demanding. And if we're not careful, that impatience can lead to rebellion, which takes us away from God, and we don't want that. So, keep time in perspective. And two things that you will come across, there are many other, but two things that especially separate us from a good and proper and healthy relationship with God. And the first one is pride. And we will see that develop within the life of King Hezekiah as we go further through the book of Isaiah. Pride is a terrible enemy of ours. We want things because of who we are, because of who we think we are. We think that we are so special. In God's eyes, we are. But in our reality, we are not. We are all one and the same. We are children of His. We all suffer from the same disparities. And pride is one of those things that you just have to guard against. I know in my own life, I can look back at times where I thought things were going really good for Peter Patton. And I would start to think that it was because of Peter Patton. And I look back now, and those were silly times, those were foolish times. Because all the blessings that I can identify in my life, I've received and enjoyed because of the goodness of the God that I serve. And that is true for each and every one of us. Pride is a terrible enemy. The other one is trusting in the world. And this is identified very easily within the writings of Isaiah if you look for it. The people of Israel, the northern nation of Israel, and the people of Judah were always looking for deals that they could make with the countries around them. They saw the threat of Assyria and they thought, oh, Egypt's going to be our friend and Egypt's going to take care of us. And they would run towards Egypt and try to establish relationships there. Or they would turn to Damascus in Syria and think, well, the Syrians, the king of Damascus, will be our friend and will help us. And the thing that Isaiah chastised them for, all they had to do was turn to God. And God will demonstrate that He is the true deliverer for all of us. He is the true Savior, and He is faithful. When we put our trust in the things of this world, the separation from God grows. Again, because if I trust in the things of this world and my world is going pretty well, I start to become prideful. And you have these two elements working against you in your relationship with God: pride and trust in the things of this world. And I'm not saying we shouldn't trust in some things. If you have medical conditions, we go to the doctor. We go to hospitals. We seek medical care, which is essential and helpful and is one of the blessings that God gives us, especially in our day and age. So it's not to the point where we don't participate in the world, but we identify. Especially as Christians, we use the Holy Spirit within us to help discern between the things that are truly good and the things that are not. And the things that are truly good, we identify as blessings from God. We participate in those. We use those. The things that are not, we stay away from, as we should. But trusting in the world, where everything, my answers for everything in life come from the world, leads us to death, destruction, and curses, as identified all the way back in Deuteronomy chapter 30. Trust in the Lord. Isaiah chapter 13, verses chapter 20 and verse 6 is the first of these prophetic cycles that you will see. And they're pretty clearly identified in the text as each one begins and as it closes out. In the first one, you're going to read about Babylon. And there's an interesting component of Babylon. And if you read the book of Hosea talks about this also. Or Habakkuk. If you read the prophet Habakkuk discusses this very clearly for us. Babylon was an instrument of God. One of Habakkuk's complaint against God is that the nation of Israel was, evil and doing bad things, and God needs to do something about it. And God says, okay, I'm going to raise up the Babylonians and take care of it. And then Habakkuk complains about that, and he says, well, wait a minute, God, the Babylonians are far worse than your people are, so why are you going to use them? And God tells Habakkuk, who are you to question me? So first and foremost, God did not create the Babylonians to be an evil people. They became that way by their choices. God, as a God of judgment and needing to judge and punish His people for their rejection of Him, uses Babylon as an instrument of justice. And we have no right to question God on how He does things or why He does things. He is God. And all of the things that He does and touches is nothing but righteousness, because that's who He is. The other thing that we learn about Babylon is not only are they going to be used as an instrument of destruction, and again, this is 100 years from now within the writings. Isaiah prophesies that they too will reap what they've sown, and destruction will be theirs. God will judge. God is righteous. He may choose to use unrighteous things to accomplish what he chooses to accomplish. We shouldn't question that. But we also need to remind ourselves that unrighteousness will always be judged by him. And his use of something unrighteous does not make it righteous. But that Babylon will be an instrument of justice, and then they will themselves be destroyed. Assyria, the current threat to Israel and Judah within the timeline of Isaiah. Assyria will find its own destruction. And you'll find as you read through chapters 1 through 37, the king of Assyria himself will eventually, his army will be scattered and dispersed by God. And he will cease his attempt to conquer Judah and Jerusalem and go back to Nineveh. And then he will be struck down within his own sanctuary. He will be struck down. So Assyria will find their destruction. The Philistines, the thorn in the side of Israel for a long time. We constantly read of the conflicts that occurred between the Philistines and God's people. They will receive their judgment from God, and it will be destruction. Moab, because of their deceit, because of their denial of the God that they know they should be serving, because of their denial of God's people, Moab will be destroyed. Damascus, Syria, and also Ephraim, and we talked, I mentioned this last week as you read through the book of Isaiah. If you look at the history of it, Ephraim engages in a civil war with Judah and Jerusalem. Brother against brother. Their fate is destruction. Then you have Cush. We would refer to that as Ethiopia, the area of Ethiopia. But Cush and Egypt will also face destruction. And again, all of these people groups that God is using Isaiah to prophesy to are receiving destruction not because God takes great enjoyment and just loves to punish people and watch people go through bad times. It's because of the choices these peoples make. Metaphorically, we can apply that to our own personal lives. Our problems are either because of bad choices that we've made in our lives, or bad choices from generations before us, beginning with Adam and Eve. Bad choices that they've made in their lives. All that is bad, anything you would consider a curse in the world, anything that is not good, originates from our rebellion. That is just absolute truth. And I've said this before. When we have bad things going on in our lives, understand it is not God pulling the levers and wanting to watch you suffer. That's not his intent. It's because of choices that we have made or choices that have been made from generations before us. You know, we've had a couple of lessons recently about how important it is for each generation to pass on blessings to the next generation. And we all have to wake up to that. If you're not aware of that, you need to be intimately aware of that. Everything that you do, everything that you think, everything that you are, is an example to the next generation. We need to be living our lives not just for ourselves, but so that the generations beyond us can have the blessings of a relationship with God in Christ. And don't expect somebody else to do that. Don't think that, well, it's the other people. They're going to take care of that. Because they're not. They're just like you. We're all going to stumble. We're going to fail. But if we're all working collectively to provide that blessing to the next generation, when one of us stumbles, the others make up for it. But we have to have that mindset of wanting to bless the next generation. The second cycle picks up in Isaiah 21 through chapter 23, verse 18. And again, prophecies for people that we can identify. Now, these may be a little bit harder for you to figure out who they are. You have to really read through the text to decipher it. They're not as clearly named. But Babylon is identified, and once again, their fate is destruction because of their choices. Edom, that's a confusing little section. It's just a few verses. But essentially what is taking place within the prophecy about Edom is they start asking the watchers, is it morning yet? Is it still dark outside? And the reply they get is that morning is coming, but darkness is still here. And then they're encouraged, though, right at the end of it. It's about 6 verses. But the prophecy about Edom, they're encouraged to come back later and ask the same question. And again, it's that element of time. God's time is not our time. When we're undergoing things in our life that we're trying to work through, and we're asking for God's relief, and we're asking for God to help us, understand that God may choose to bless you within that time period. God may also choose to wait for another time. We may never know the why, but we have to trust that God knows what He is doing and He has a righteous purpose for His actions. Arabia, which doesn't really exist as a country, it's nomadic peoples in a certain particular place that are identified and talked about. Because of their choices, destruction. Jerusalem, eventually, because of their choices, destruction. Tyre, because of their choices. Eventually, destruction. Then we get to the third section, which is really a summary of all these oracles that are taking place. Chapters 24 through 27. It starts off with, a really uplifting message from Isaiah. God's going to lay waste to the entire earth. And just remember, the earth as they know it consists of all these countries that we just talked about and named. And Isaiah is just basically saying that God is going to judge everybody. No one gets a pass. All peoples will account for their choice for God or their choices against God. God will lay waste to the earth, as shown in chapter 24 and verse 3. God will reign. God is king. One of the things that happens in our lives, and it's very human, we come into relationship with God, we become Christians, and everything is fine. And over time, we kind of let our thoughts become consumed with the things of this world. And we really don't pay a lot of attention to our relationship with God or to God Himself. And we kind of drift. We may not even be conscious of it until some type of calamity occurs in our lives. We just drift. But this is a problem that God confronts head on. He states very clearly in all of these prophecies of Isaiah, it will be very clear to you, God has to be preeminent in your life. God will reign. There will be no doubt in your mind who is king. Cindy and I have been watching a show called The Monarch, if you're familiar with that. We're kind of latecomers to it. I think it came out last year or the year before. And it's all about Queen Elizabeth during her reign and her family and stuff. And there's one thing about that. If you ask anybody on the street, chances are they're going to know who is queen or king of England at any particular time in modern history. It is something that we just all know. There is no doubt in our minds. There may be a lot of other things about the monarchy of Britain that we don't know about or don't care about, but that's kind of walking around knowledge. You know who the queen is, or you know who the king is, depending on the period of time. Isaiah makes it very, very clear. There is something much, much more important that you need to fundamentally understand than earthly kings and queens. You need to understand who the King of the universe is. Who is it that truly reigns over all creation? And that is the God that we serve. He's it. It's unequivocal. We've talked about, I've referred back to my study of the Psalms with you a year or so ago. It's very clear as you read through the Psalms. They fall back into this knowledge that they have and the comfort that it gives them, that they serve the Creator God, the God of the universe, the one and only. There is none other. There never has been another. There never will be another. God reigns. Period. Big period. End of statement. And we have to fundamentally understand that. As you go through your life, you need to remind yourself on a regular basis of who is in charge, who is truly king. And it is the God that we serve. Another thing, a fact, a truth: God will save His people. And when I say God will save His people, that salvation is extended to those that don't even want to be His people. It's offered freely, and we will see that, especially in the discussions about Cush and Egypt and even Assyria. The final thing is an absolute truth. In the end, God's people and all people will worship Him. It's just going to happen. Isaiah chapter 13:11, I'd like to just pull out a few verses real quick in our final few minutes here from chapters 13 through 27, and to kind of give you a flavor for what we've been talking about. First thing in chapter 13, verse 11, I will punish the world for its evil, wicked people for their sin. I will put an end to the pride of the insolent. I will bring down the arrogance of tyrants. It is important that we remind ourselves that these conditions that Isaiah describes, that God is going to judge are conditions of choice. As I said, God did not create the Assyrians to be an evil people. They chose that. God did not create the Babylonians to be an evil people. They chose that. God did not create the Israelites to be a people who would abandon Him and rebel against Him. They chose that. So as you read about all these people groups and the destructions, especially the destructions, the curses, the calamity that's going to occur, it is healthy for us in our day and time to remind ourselves they chose this. Again, going back to Deuteronomy 30, each and every one of us has a choice. We can choose life or we can choose death. And choosing life is not hard. God has declared, I'm going to make it easy for you. Give me a chance. But typically we don't pay attention to that. We chase after all the shiny objects out there in the world, and we embroil ourselves in the world. And unfortunately for many, it will lead to their destruction, as is evident with the people groups that Isaiah prophesies about. It is because of their choices. Chapter 14, verse 1. And I've told you last week when we went through this, I said, when you're reading about all the destruction and all the bad things that are going to happen, don't let that get you down. Just keep reading through it, because you're going to find these beautiful nuggets contained within Isaiah. It shows just how compassionate, how loving, how faithful God is. And not only to His people, He extends the olive branch to all people that they may come into His family. Isaiah chapter 14, verse 1. the Lord will certainly have compassion on Jacob. And the Hebrew word there for compassion, we talked about this in our study of the book of Psalms. It's a mother's love. That's the best way for us to understand it. It's the love of a mother to their child. In the same way, in the Psalms, what we read is in the same way that a nursing mother looks upon her baby with a motherly love, is the love that God extends towards us. And even though God punishes, God will still have compassion on Jacob. And that's not exclusive. As we continue to read through, and especially as we understand the New Testament, by extension, that's available to all people. It's not exclusive to the Jews. God will again choose Israel as his special people. And we know on this side of the cross, God has chosen each and every one of us. He wants us to be his. That is his choice. We fight and rebel against it, but that is his choice. And God longs to restore us. And not only to his people of Israel, but as it states there, resident foreigners will join them and unite with the family of Jacob. That's a reference to a future time. The year of the Lord's favor, as we'll discuss in a few weeks. We live under a different era on this side of the cross. We live in a time where all peoples will join with Jacob and be in relationship with the one God. Chapter 16, verse 5. I love this passage. It has one of my favorite Hebrew words in it. It reads here out of the NET Bible, "Then a trustworthy king will be established. He will rule in a reliable manner. This one from David's family, he will be sure to make just decisions and will be experienced in executing justice." If you read this passage in different translations, you will get some variance in how they're presented. In the NIV, it reads, "In love, a throne will be established. In faithfulness, a man will sit on it. One from the house of David, one who in judging seeks justice and speeds the cause of righteousness." In other translations, it will talk about this king will come from the tabernacle of David, from the tent. The original language literally is a tent, from the tent of David. The word that I like is the word kesed. Translated here on the screen as trustworthy, translated in the NIV as love, translated in the New American Standard Bible as loving kindness. It's a covenant love. It's the strongest love that there is. It's a faithful love. Sometimes translated as mercy that God will have. And this king, this messianic figure that's being described here, will have. One from the house of David, one who, and then the two key elements here are things that we need to pay attention to and incorporate in our lives. This king will be a king of justice. This king will be a king of righteousness. We talked about this for the last couple of weeks. God is a God of justice. We need to be people of justice. God is a God of righteousness. We need to be people of righteousness. We must seek to embellish those qualities within our lives. Chapter 17, verse 7. At that time, men will trust in their Creator. They will depend on the Holy One of Israel. While Isaiah is prophesying about Damascus and Ephraim, this little passage is put in here. And it's a reminder. One of the effects that judgment has is not merely destruction, but it will result in people that make good choices for them to return and trust God and depend upon God. And that's what God asks for. Don't trust in this world. Trust in me. Chapter 18 and verse 7. At that time, tribute will be brought to the Lord. Here he's talking about his prophecy to Cush or Ethiopia. And he's stating, as a result of my punishment of them, there's coming a time that they're going to bring tributes, gifts, and presents to me. And not only are they going to bring them to me, they're going to bring them to Mount Zion, where I reside. And that's what we find in this prophecy. Isaiah chapter 19, verse 25. While prophesying about Egypt, and here's one that we can take clearly to indicate the expanse of God's grace and mercy. The Lord who commands armies will pronounce a blessing over the earth. Blessed be my people, Egypt, and the work of my hands, Assyria, and my special possession, Israel. We are all, as human beings, God's people, if we choose to be so. God looks at us all as being His children, and He wants nothing more than for us to be His family. So we'll close with this. Isaiah chapter 27, verses 12 and 13 closes out this entire section. At that time, the Lord will shake the tree from the Euphrates River to the stream of Egypt. Then you will be gathered up, one by one, O Israelites. At that time, a large trumpet will be blown, and the ones lost in the land of Assyria will come, as well as the refugees in the land of Egypt. They will worship the Lord on the holy mountain in Jerusalem. There is a day coming. We've seen it happen in history, from the deportation of the people to Babylon and to Persia, from the dispersion of the northern nation of Israel around the world by the Assyrians. And we have it in a promise from Jesus Christ Himself that this is what's going to happen in the end times. And God won't just gather His people like, we might herd up a bunch of cattle or goats or anything else. He's going to seek us out one by one and pick us up. Our God is a God of salvation. Our God is a God of redemption. Our God is a God of restoration. And that's the message we see unfolding within the book of Isaiah. Thank you all very much, and have a blessed day.